What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Rock the Dragon podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Tim Bridgewater. It has been a while, depending on which podcast you listen to. If you only ever listen to Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast, it's been longer for you than it has been for those of you who listen to Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast, which is, of course, a podcast that I did covering Dragon Ball Daima. I was not able to successfully make it through all 20 episodes of Daima. I go into great detail on that podcast as to why that was, but I'll just summarize it here for you right now and say that show sucked ass. And that's not even a phrase that I use, man. So if I'm using a brand new phrase, like, you know, something was bad. Anyway, this is not about Dragon Ball Daima. This is about the return of Dragon Ball Super. But since I have this podcast, which is obviously, my Dragon Ball Super podcast and my Dragon Ball Daima podcast, I'm actually going to do a simultaneous release of this episode on both podcast streams. Just seemed like the smart thing to do because the Dragon Ball Daima one is the most recent one, but the news pertains to Dragon Ball Super. So it also makes sense for me to talk about it on my Dragon Ball Super podcast page. If you want to hear about my thoughts about Daima, you know, I did manage to make it through the first 10 episodes, and then I came back with a series finale episode that kind of summarized all of my thoughts on Daima. You may be asking, well, why did you only cover the first 10 episodes? Truthfully, I just wasn't enjoying the show, and I don't have much interest at this point in my life to talk about something that I'm just not enjoying. It's just no fun talking about that every week. I found that I was being really negative, and it just wasn't the kind of energy I wanted to have from week to week in my life at this point. So I stopped talking about it. But I did come back and summarize my final thoughts on it in the end. So if you're someone who didn't have a chance to watch Dragon Ball Daima yet and you're thinking about checking it out, I do recommend checking it out. And there is a whole podcast there for you to enjoy, so you can have my general thoughts on it. We'll get into it a little bit more throughout this conversation, but this, of course, is mostly pertaining to Dragon Ball Super because, man, we got some major developments here on Dragon Ball Super. I'm not sure how many of my listeners actually keep up with the more news aspects of the Dragon Ball world. If you're a lot like me, you're not really much into the news. You just kind of like to enjoy the content as it is released. Depending on whether or not you're a gamer or you're a fan of the manga or a fan of the anime. Longtime listeners of my podcast will know that I don't typically talk about the news. That's not really the kind of podcast that I have. I like to talk about the actual anime itself, the episodes themselves, the characters themselves, etc. However, as someone who covered every single episode of Dragon Ball Super, there was no way I could not talk about this news, right? Because imagine how it felt to me to learn that, a show that I talked about for over 2.5 years, where I went into great depth and detail, reviewing from week to week, all 131 episodes of a show. Not only is that show planning to return, but it's also going to be remade or redone, so to speak. Okay. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about here, don't worry. We're going to break it all down. We're going to go into it. I'm going to get you caught up on it. And then I'm going to give my thoughts about this as someone who spent many hours of my life talking about a show just to find out, oh, hey, guess what? Remember, all that shit you talked about for 2.5 years? We're just going to redo it all. It's like, really? Okay, interesting. Anyway, let's get into it, okay? Nice to be here back with you guys again. Hopefully you enjoy this. You can always feel free to reach out to me at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. I understand that my podcasting is not exactly active and current, but there's just no way I could go without talking about this, okay? So in case you have missed this news, it's not exactly new anymore at this point, but this is less about the actual news, the timeliness of it, and more so about my opinions on what was announced. Okay. So recently there was a 40th anniversary event that was held called Dragon Ball Genki Damatsuri. Okay. And this was a celebration of 40 years of Dragon Ball, as was the release of Dragon Ball Daima. But this was a live event where they were expected to make a bunch of announcements about new and upcoming releases and different projects that will be coming out in the foreseeable future, and giving us as fans an update as to what we can look forward to in the coming years as fans of Dragon Ball, because there was a lot of speculation and people were wondering, well, is there going to be a follow-up to Dragon Ball Daima? Will Super return to some extent? There's been talk for years about the return of Dragon Ball Super, where we can finally see the remainder of the manga be adapted into anime form. A lot of people, when there was word that there was a new anime in the works, most of us assumed that it would have been the return of Dragon Ball Super, because that would have made perfect sense, right? But then they blew a lot of people's minds by announcing Dragon Ball Daima. Okay, and I don't know if that was for better or worse there, but I don't think a lot of people was expecting that to be the announcement. And from what I can tell, most people weren't very happy about it. Okay, so this news should hopefully make up for that. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that as a part of this 40th anniversary Dragon Ball celebration, there is a video that was, I believe it may have been displayed at the event. It is now on YouTube. So if you have not seen this, you're going to want to just look up Dragon Ball 40th anniversary event video. This absolutely wonderful, beautiful, awesome video, just kind of showcasing the history of Dragon Ball over the past 40 years. The celebration of Akira Toriyama, but most importantly, it's animated and created in a way to where it actually brings the manga to life. Now you may be saying, well, isn't that what the anime does? But what I mean here is that they actually take pages from the manga and animate them, with the panels and all that kind of stuff. Awesome video. Awesome video. And if you've been a Dragon Ball fan for most of your life at this point, the way I have, it'll make you'll get the feels a little bit while you're watching it. So if you haven't seen that, regardless of what else we talk about here today, go look that up and just let that shake you to your core for a minute. Okay. Now there was a number of different announcements made at this event regarding toy releases and video game releases and stuff like that. But what we mostly talk about here on Rock the Dragon podcast is, of course, the anime. That's always been my thing. I never read the manga. I'm an anime guy, and I'd like to just have that pure anime experience where I'm experiencing it for the first time when I watch it in the anime, which is ironic as we get into the next topic here, because we're about to experience something that we've already experienced 3 different times, depending on your level of Dragon Ball Super, knowledge. So one of the main things here that was announced at this event is that not only is Dragon Ball Super about to return in fall of this year, but there is a remake. It is going to be kicked off with what currently being titled as Dragon Ball Super Beerus. And you may be wondering what that could possibly be. Is this some sort of continuation of the story of Beerus? And, are we going to, see some new adventures of Beerus? Maybe the origin story of Beerus? Maybe some things that we haven't explored before? And if you're thinking that, you're going to be 100% wrong, because what it is actually just yet another retelling of what is essentially the Beerus arc in Dragon Ball Super, what is essentially the Battle of Gods movie. The Dragon Ball, what's it called? I guess it was Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods was the movie. And of course, the Dragon Ball Super manga Beerus arc. Okay, so this is a story that's already been told 3 different times in 3 different forms, and this is going to be a 4th telling of that story. Okay. I don't know if you guys can tell, but by the way that I'm talking about it, I think this is incredibly weird. I think this is incredibly weird because my first reaction is, okay, why do we need to tell this same story again? So let's just kind of talk about what this means and possibly theorize why they may be doing this again for a fourth time. So some important things to kind of mention about it is that it's not going to be the exact same presentation and story that we got in the Battle of Gods movie or that we got in the Dragon Ball Super anime. They're going to have to change some things here. Otherwise, what would be the point? So some of the more obvious things that we can expect here is obviously better animation and being more closely aligned with the manga. Taking out some things that maybe didn't fit the story as well. I believe that this release, and it is just this part for now, Dragon Ball Super Beerus is just a retelling of just the Beerus part of Dragon Ball Super. I believe it's going to be about 6 episodes, whereas originally that arc in Dragon Ball Super was about 14. You guys can fact check me on that, but I think it's something along those lines. So let me just go ahead and read the summary here that I'm getting from the official Dragon Ball site. There were rumors about a remake of Dragon Ball Super that were going around for certainly months, as far as I was aware. Once again, I don't keep up with a lot of the news stuff because I try not to be spoiled on what's coming, because I didn't read the manga, so I don't like to dive too deeply into Dragon Ball Super online in terms of the manga because I don't want to read any spoilers. Obviously, some of those spoilers have been unavoidable, but I try to keep myself a little bit unspoiled for as long as I can. Which I thought it was crazy, but it ended up being true. Okay, so let me just read this here. It says Dragon Ball Super Beerus, a project that was started a few years ago, is the newly enhanced edition of the anime Dragon Ball Super. Enhanced by the latest visual expression, every scene, especially the battle scenes, is even more immersive, providing a more faithful and detailed reproduction of the original work by Akira Toriyama, and it will deliver a quality that is sure to fully satisfy audiences. Okay, so if you were just listening to that, generally speaking, it might remind you of something else, because it's crazy of an idea as this sounds. It's not entirely unheard of for this type of thing to happen, specifically in the Dragon Ball world, because at first notice, it may sound a lot like Dragon Ball Z Kai, right? I talked about Kai on one of the episodes. I'm not sure if that was, honestly, I don't remember if it was on this podcast or the other one, but for the longest time, I did not watch Dragon Ball Z Kai. I just didn't feel like it was something I really was interested in, as someone being a very, very big fan of the original sort of Funimation run of Dragon Ball Z, even with all the filler in it. But eventually I did watch it and I did talk about it on an episode of the podcast. But if you were just reading that synopsis, you would think, okay, well, Dragon Ball Z Kai was all those things. They made it more faithful to the manga. They reanimated at least some of the things. They tightened up some things. They took some things out. They added some stuff here. They redid the voice work to make it more accurate to the manga and stuff like that. So it doesn't sound that crazy when you think about it like that. The biggest difference here between this and Dragon Ball Z Kai, however, though, they're redoing the entire thing here. Okay, whereas Dragon Ball Z Kai still used largely most of the original animation and story from Z, and they just went in and cut out filler and tightened some things up. This is a completely new thing from the ground up. It is the same story, though. It's the same story, but all new animation, tighter, more vibrant, shorter, tighter, quicker, more exciting, whatever they want to call it. So for those of you that might be thinking this is sort of like Dragon Ball Super Kai, this is largely different from what that would have traditionally been sort of conceived as or perceived as. This is a whole new thing. That is, once again, though, essentially telling the exact same story that we've already gotten 3 other times. With that being said, it brings the question why, right? Why would they be interested in doing this over again? Why would they be telling the same story over again? Well, as many of us know, if you watch Dragon Ball Super has notoriously been sort of known for, especially in the earlier episodes, and obviously I talk about it all on Rock the Dragon, Dragon Ball Super podcast. There were a lot of parts in there where there was some really, really bad animation. And that was largely due in part to them releasing the manga at the same time as the anime and trying to remain consistent with the release of the manga. So some of the anime episodes got rushed. They didn't have enough time to really put enough effort into it. And we ended up getting some stuff that looked really bad. And to my knowledge, they have since gone back and fixed a lot of those animation problems, but it's still kind of this stain, right? It's kind of like this stinky smell and this stain on the legacy of Dragon Ball, that they had all these episodes that really just looked like shit. And I see this as an attempt to maybe just give it another shot and just refresh everything from the ground up, with it only being about 6 episodes. Obviously there's room allowed there for this to be a lot tighter and for the animation to be a lot better, because they only have to worry about working on this one arc. And with all the bad things I have to say about Dragon Ball Daima, one thing I can definitely say about it is that it looked amazing. So, and that was just a 20 episode series. So given the fact that they only had to worry about working on 20 episodes, that allowed them to be able to put a lot more work into those 20 episodes. So this being a much tighter, shorter series on its own will allow them more time to be able to focus on making sure it looks and sounds as best as it possibly can, while still hopefully being as, more accurate to Akira Toriyama's original vision for it. So that's one way, this could actually end up being an improvement, just trying to make up for the mistakes of the past. I mean, I once again, I think it's super weird to tell the same story again, but they obviously feel like they have some sort of a good idea here. Otherwise, I don't think they'd be doing it. Right? So you can actually view a trailer for this saga that is online right now. So if you look at it, you can see that it clearly looks a lot better than what we got before, especially that initial run of these episodes. How it stands in comparison to the Battle of Gods movie itself, I think that still kind of remains to be seen. To me, that obviously would have been the more ultimate version of this story. It's hard for me to believe that it's going to look better than the movie did. I mean, that was a movie that was released worldwide theatrically, okay? Which means they put all of the budget and money behind that. So I don't know how they're expecting this to necessarily be better than that movie in terms of the way it looks and everything. But, we're just going to have to stay tuned and see. And we'll come back around to this. Okay, now let's get back. Let's get over to the other major announcement here. And this is the one that most of us will be really excited about. And that is the announcement of the return of Dragon Ball Super, as in they're going to actually continue the story. The story that was explored in the manga, we're now going to get the rest of that in the anime form. And this is titled currently Dragon Ball Super: The Galactic Patrol. Okay, so I'm going to read the quick summary here, and then we're going to dive into this for a minute. It says here, this will be the story following the universe survival arc, which for us English dub viewers, also known as a Tournament of Power, of the anime Dragon Ball Super, which aired between 2015 and 2018. It also appears in the manga Dragon Ball as the Galactic Patrol Prisoner arc. The main characters, Son Goku and Vegeta, work together with the members of the Galactic Patrol, the Peacekeepers of the Galaxy, to begin a super scale battle against a new enemy, Planet Eater Moro. Okay, so I don't know how many of you guys have been keeping up with the manga. Once again, I don't read the manga. I usually just wait for the anime. But you've probably heard that the manga does continue with an arc featuring a villain called Moro. Okay, and then it even goes even beyond that. So this is the telling of that story that picks up after the Tournament of Power. So, if you listen to my podcast, you know that episode 131 covered the final episode of that half of Dragon Ball Super, which concluded with the Universe Survival Tournament arc, also known as the Tournament of Power. This will be picking up after that. So we're finally getting this new story that we've been waiting on. Dragon Ball Super ended about 8 years ago at this point, which is mind-blowing to me that it's been that long, as someone who talked about it obviously for years. It's exciting to finally be receiving the rest of the story, and I have every reason to be excited here. I tell you one thing though, I didn't know much about it, so the fact that this story revolves around the Galactic Patrol, I don't know how to feel about that, because if you were a long-time listener of my Dragon Ball Super podcast, you know that Jaco is a member of the Galactic Patrol, and you also know that Jaco was one of my least favorite characters in the history of Dragon Ball. So if this means more Jaco, I'm honestly not excited about that. However, I'm excited about the return of Dragon Ball Super. I think it's great. I think it's time. It's been long enough. So I'm pumped about that. I've heard nothing but good things about this arc, Moro, and what happens after this point on. So I think some people are saying that this upcoming half of Dragon Ball Super is the best of the entire series, at least based on what they've explored in the manga. Now, I think it's safe to say that this will probably be a much more faithful adaptation of the manga than what we got with the previous Dragon Ball Super series, generally speaking, because if they're going back and redoing the Beerus arc to make it more faithful and accurate, then they're certainly going to do that with this as well, right? My question is this though. It's hard for me to understand why they just don't do this kind of shit from the beginning. Like why put it out and then say, you know what, we're going to go back and redo it now and make sure it's more accurate to the manga. Just make it accurate to the manga from the start. Now, I understand that that's difficult to do because usually the manga and the anime are kind of being developed at the same time, right? So then it's hard to make it, to adapt it, because they're kind of coming out, being worked on at the same time in a lot of cases, or at least in the case of Dragon Ball Super. But that's just a logistics thing that they can figure out with, the company and the way that they work on these projects and the way that they develop this stuff, is that they can just figure that out. Because it's once again, it's crazy to me that we're getting a retelling of Dragon Ball Super. And this is where I wanted to come back and tie these two together, that while there have been no other official announcements regarding this, to my knowledge, it is safe to assume, very safe to assume, that they're not just remaking the Beerus arc of Dragon Ball Super, but they're going to do the entire series up until the Galactic Patrol. And the reason why it's safe to assume that is because, one, it doesn't make sense to just retell one part of the story, but it's the fact, it's how they're titling the series is Dragon Ball Super Beerus, Dragon Ball Super The Galactic Patrol. So then it stands to reason there's also going to be a Dragon Ball Super Resurrection F, or Frieza, or whatever they want to call it, and a Dragon Ball Super Goku Black, a Dragon Ball Super Tournament of Power. So it's safe to assume we should be expecting an entirely a redo of the entire series, one that's going to be much shorter, tighter, hopefully with much better animation, and it'll allow them to be able to give every single episode and arc the full treatment that it deserves, because they'll be taking them one at a time. So if all they have to focus on now is a 6-episode Beerus arc, then they can make sure those 6 episodes are as good as they could possibly be. And then if all they have to do is worry about a 6 or 7 episode Return of Frieza arc, then they can make sure they're as good as they can possibly be, right? And then and so forth. Now, does that mean? Of course, that means we'll be getting the Resurrection F storyline again as well, even though we already had a movie about that. Okay, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of people did not enjoy those arcs. I would say the Beerus arc and the Frieza arc are easily the worst parts of Dragon Ball Super. I don't remember why right now because I haven't seen Dragon Ball Super in a long time, but I have a million different episodes here for you to go back and listen to. I'm sure I broke it all down. But I think it's safe to assume we're just going to get a remake of the entire series. Ultimately, I'm not sure what the end goal here is. It just seems like maybe it's an attempt to have just a more impactful, concise, sort of retelling of Super that can, for new people that are coming along, maybe they can just watch that one instead of watching the other one. Because, I mean, Dragon Ball Super didn't even have any filler episodes in there. I mean, they had some episodes that just weren't good, but there wasn't really anything that we would consider filler. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, every episode was considered canon into the story, but a lot of it just was unnecessary because it wasn't good. The one thing I can think of offhand is that there was an episode where they went to another planet and there was copy Vegeta and stuff like that. And that didn't seem to really, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think that mattered, but it was considered canon. Unlike Dragon Ball Z, where there were just whole episodes and sagas, basically like Garlic Jr., for instance, that just weren't even considered canon. So we didn't really get that in Dragon Ball Super. So it's even more interesting to me that they're deciding to redo this, because it's not like there's things that need to be cut out for the sake of, filler. But those of you who read the manga and also watch the anime, I'm sure you'll be able to point out, specific differences in between the two versions. And it sounds like we'll get something that's a little bit more accurate and tied into that. So, and this also begs a question, and I'm only really posing this question just because I feel like it needs to be posed, not because I think they're going to do it. But if you watch Dragon Ball Daima, okay, spoilers for Dragon Ball Daima, that there's some major transformations that happen in that series. 1, Vegeta going Super Saiyan 3 in there. 2, Goku going Super Saiyan level 4, okay, in there. And I won't get into all the details of that. I mean, I talked about it on my Daima podcast, but that happened in that series. And you also know that Daima takes place before Super. Okay, so by them allowing those transformations to happen, they sort of created new plot holes for Dragon Ball Super, because then when we watch Super, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so why did Goku never go Super Saiyan 4 in Super? Why did Vegeta never go Super Saiyan 3 in Super? The actual reason is because they hadn't thought of this shit yet, and we know that. But they created new plot holes by doing that. Redoing these Dragon Ball Super episodes could theoretically give them an opportunity to sort of retroactively fix some of those plot holes. Meaning maybe we'd get a Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta in this new Super retelling. Maybe we get a Super Saiyan 4 Goku in this new Super retelling. Because it would allow them the opportunity to do that. If they're going to redo it anyway, they might as well make everything consistent. But I don't think they're going to do that. Okay? I don't think they're going to do that. And the reason why that is because if they're trying to make this version more accurate to the manga, well, Goku doesn't turn Super Saiyan 4 in the manga, and Vegeta doesn't turn Super Saiyan 3 in the manga for Dragon Ball Super. So there would be no reason that they would add that in now. Not to mention is that we have every reason to believe that these stories are largely going to be the same. I'm not expecting any major story differences here. But giving these two characters additional transformations would largely change the story, because a lot of this Super Saiyan God and Super Saiyan Blue stuff would kind of be offset by the fact that Goku can turn Super Saiyan 4. So then all of a sudden you're having to rewrite a lot of your arcs based around these transformations. So I don't think they're going to do that. I just think they're going to continue to ignore it and pretend like it never fucking happened or whatever. The usual lazy Dragon Ball, the lazy, modern day Dragon Ball stuff. So I don't think we're going to get that here. However, I could not have, talked about this without at least considering the fact that there is an opportunity here to fix that if they chose to fix it. But I don't think they will. And not to mention the fact that there's still some debate on whether or not Daima is canon or not. Everything that I have learned about Daima lends to the fact that it is canon. I don't know why they would have spent time creating 20 episodes that could theoretically fit in the at the end of Dragon Ball Z, largely, if they just weren't going to have it matter, right? And not to mention, if it wasn't canon, I think there would have been some sort of an announcement to say that this is just a fun 20 episode thing and that's all that it is. But the fact that there doesn't seem to be any word about it at all, to me lends to the fact that it's canon. Okay. Once again, I did not like Dragon Ball Daima. I just didn't care for it. Just wasn't my thing. I went to great detail on the other podcast on why that is. Dragon Ball Super largely was not great either. I'm not exactly, okay. So this is the part where I'll just, how does this affect me as a podcaster who's talked about Dragon Ball Super? What are my thoughts on all of this? I think it's super weird. And I think it's pretty crazy to just redo something that they've already done. But I have to wonder, I have to assume that they feel like this is going to be better than what they did before. Why else do it? Now that's one of my concerns. When you decide to redo something, you're taking a really big risk, right? Because there's an assumption there that the new version of it is going to be objectively better than the previous version, right? Why else would you redo it? You have to have a certain level of confidence that the new version is going to be better than the old one. But that's totally subjective because this is all opinion. It's very possible that they redo these arcs and they be worse, quote unquote, than they were before. They might look better. Okay. Whether they look better or not is pretty objective, right? I mean, we all know what good art and good animation looks like. So I'm not really concerned about that. The question is that, is whatever they're planning to do story-wise here to tighten this up and remove some things and change a few things here and there and all that kind of stuff, is that ultimately going to be a better story than what we got before? Because that's a really big risk, and they would look real stupid if they redid all this shit and it was just as bad as the original version or worse. So I'll say, Shueisha and Toei and Toyotaro and all these guys, they're taking some really big risks by redoing this and telling these stories yet again. But I don't want to be too negative about it. I know that it's risky. I know that they're taking a chance here. I know that it seems crazy, but I think most of us as Dragon Ball fans are just happy that we know what's coming for our favorite IP. We know what we have to look forward to this year, next year. I'm always excited to get more Dragon Ball. I don't have to like everything, but I'll definitely give everything a shot. You know, the same way I powered through Daima, I'll power through everything else. Because I think once you become when Dragon Ball hits you in your heart, the way it hit me and most of us, then you're a fan for life at that point. You're a fan for life. So give me what you got, guys, and I'll always be here to at least watch it. Like I said, I'm not going to like everything, but I'm at least going to give it a shot, and that's just exciting, like generally speaking. So what does this mean for the future of me as a Dragon Ball podcaster and such? You know what? I say this every time this conversation comes up. I have no idea. I have no idea. We know that we're getting this Dragon Ball Beerus saga in the fall of this year. So we don't necessarily have a very long time to wait for this. Question is, the question I have to ask myself as a podcaster is, how do I talk about something that's only 6 episodes that I've already seen before, essentially? Because remember, they're just retelling the same story again. Okay? I already know how the Beerus saga goes. So what I largely like to do on this podcast is come on here and give my thoughts on things, but I'm also sort of speculating as to what there is to come next. There's a little bit of mystery involved. There's revelations that happen. I'm not sure how to talk about something that I've already seen and where I already know where the story is going. What does that look like? Am I now comparing the previous version of Super to the new version? And then am I also comparing that to the movie? I don't know what that looks like. I'm just trying to think of what that would look like week to week talking about that. So to be honest with you, right now, I don't know. Do I do I bring the podcast back for 6 episodes and then just end it for a couple months and then come back and do another 6 episodes for the next arc? And so these are all things I have to kind of figure out as time goes on. But I'll say this, I never thought I'd still be talking about it now, 8 years later, but here I am. So I guess as long as I'm alive and as long as there's Dragon Ball content being released, there's always a chance that Tim Bridgewater will be down to come back and talk about it. So I'd be curious to see what you guys think about it. As always, you can send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com for our email segment, which is called What Are You Saying? So send me an email. Let me know your thoughts about this. What do you think about this? Is this exciting? Is it weird? Is it stupid? Are you just as baffled and confused by all of this as I am? Will you be tuning into it? Do you see a chance for improvement here? Do you see in any way, shape, or form that this version of the Beerus arc can be any better or worse than it already was? Is it going to be better than the Battle of Gods movie? Or is it going to be worse than that? Did you even like that movie? Do you care about Beerus? There's so many questions to answer here, because I think that there's a much larger problem with Beerus that goes beyond just this arc. I think the entire creation of that character is very problematic and has always been problematic. And I talked about it many, many, many times. Just the creation of him, they automatically started retconning things about, in the lore of Dragon Ball. Because now we're supposed to believe that there's been this god of destruction who's been asleep this entire time. He's been around this entire time. And he was the one who actually ordered the destruction of planet Vegeta, which I've always hated that decision to retcon that. But I don't know. They've also kind of changed the story a couple times, because they may have I think they might have retconned that in Dragon Ball Super Broly. But I'll say this. I think we can all agree that there's been a lot of inconsistencies and kind of confusion with, canon and not canon and retcons in Dragon Ball. And maybe with this retelling of Dragon Ball Super, they'll streamline some of that stuff so that it makes more sense and that it's easier to follow. But probably not. They're actually the truth is they're probably just doing this so they can sell more toys. Okay, and I hate that I've become a little bit of a negative Dragon Ball fan, but I talked about this quite a bit on the last few episodes of my Dragon Ball Daima podcast. Now I feel like they can just re-release the same toys with just slight tweaks and say, oh no, but now this is the Dragon Ball Super Beerus version of the Beerus action figure. And maybe he'll have one extra earring in his ear or some bullshit to make it worth it. But there really are a lot of sort of decisions that have to be considered about returning here. For one, as it stands right now, I don't believe we have much of an idea of how the release of these new projects are going to sort of turn out. Meaning, is this just going to be a thing where we get the sub version, first, and then it takes us a year or a couple of months or something before we get the dub? Because that's going to be a big factor as well. That a big determining factor on whether or not I decide that I can return to talk about it or not. It'd be nice to be able to talk about this along with the rest of the world at the same time. Now, I will say this, them only doing a couple of episodes at a time, focusing on each arc individually, not only allows them to be able to put a lot more focus and time and energy on making sure the animation is as crisp and vibrant and awesome as it deserves to be. But then also, since it's only a handful of episodes, we should be able to get the dub a lot faster, right? So maybe this is a scenario for once we can get a simultaneous worldwide release of the English dub and the sub at the same time. Now, I can tell you that'd be a lot more appealing for me, who, as someone who's only ever covered the dub, that I can actually be current with the rest of the world when I'm talking about these things. And maybe I'll get some new listeners out of it too. So fingers crossed that it'll be one of those situations to where, because it's only a handful of episodes at a time, that we'll be able to get it a lot faster if we're English dub viewers. So holding out hope for that. Anyway, guys, let me know what your thoughts are here. As always, if I get I don't think I've mentioned this on the Dragon Ball Super podcast, but I definitely mentioned it on the Dragon Ball Daima podcast, is that I don't necessarily need to get 50 emails in order for me to return with a new episode. That used to be my mindset. My mindset used to be, oh man, I got to have a couple of emails to justify coming back for a new episode. Even if I get I need to have at least one or two, but I'll consider coming back even if I only got two. I will just have a much shorter episode. I'm totally okay with that. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past couple years, and I realized I was just being too hard on myself, thinking that if I didn't come back with an hour-long episode, then it wasn't worth it to you guys. But you guys have told me more than once, hey, even if it's a 15-minute episode, it'd be nice to just have that to hear your thoughts on some things. Okay, so if you got anything you want to say about it, let me know. I'll come back with another episode and talk about it. And between now and the release of Dragon Ball Super Beerus, there is a chance that I could pop up sporadically throughout that time. I'm trying not to write off any possibility completely. As long as there's something worth talking about and the engagement is there, there's a possibility that we can keep this moving. But if I don't hear much, then you probably won't hear from me. Okay. Anyway, I hope everyone has been doing well. Let me know your thoughts about that, guys. Nice to be back chatting with you again. I hope everyone has been holding up pretty well in this crazy, crazy world that we're living in now. And it's just awesome that some of us are fortunate enough to still be around to be able to enjoy Dragon Ball and be able to lose ourselves in this world and give us a much needed escape and break from all of the other trials and tribulations of life. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to sign off here. So until next time for Rock the Dragon podcast, my name is Tim Bridgewater. I will see you guys next time. Keep on rocking the dragon.